It was a trip to the Andreessen Horowitz office today on break from the RSA conference in San Francisco, California, when I got a chance to sit down and confer with Marty Roesch. Marty is most notable for developing the most popular intrusion detection system software in use, Snort. We discussed how he built that project and sold it for nearly $3 billion, how he's pivoted into investing and back again into being the CEO of Netography. We also talked about BYOD systems, encryption, and how ephemeral systems are all making things more difficult. Lastly, we discussed his sailboat racing experience. And now, here's Martin Roesch. Hello and welcome to the RSnake Show. Today I have with me Martin Roesch. How are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm going to call you Marty. I know you as Marty.
Yeah. That's fine. Martin is, that's the way that I figure out if I've met somebody before or not. If I say Marty, I've probably met them at some point. Nice to see you again, instead of good to meet you, which is horribly embarrassing if they're like, oh, don't you remember we had a beer in 2009? And I was like, oh yeah, sorry.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, you, I'm sure, have a similar problem. You've met probably thousands and thousands and thousands of people, so it's a little rough.
It is. There's a lot of repeat offenders who eventually the dim bulb in my brain goes on. It's like, I know this person.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people where I'm just like, oh man.
We're at the Andreessen Horowitz office today, but because RSA is in town, the RSA Security Conference, are you looking at anything there? Anything interesting? Do anything there?
Well, I'm there, and it's just nonstop meetings for me. So I've been in investor meetings and partner meetings and some media events and some customer stuff and investor dinners and so on and so forth. So
fun.
Yeah. For certain values of fun.
Well, I mean, once upon a time we were both just a bunch of hackers and we would just be behind a keyboard all day. Something happened. I don't know what it is, but something pretty monumental happened. Yeah,
well, I think the industry started getting monetized, right? So the guys who kind of had it together enough to go surf that wave, that's us now, I guess.
Yeah. Lucky ducks. So it would probably be worth talking a little bit about Snort. Kind of the old days. It's how you made your claim to fame, and I think it's really interesting, actually. Can you tell people what it is for the non-technical types?
Oh, sure. So Snort is a network intrusion detection and prevention technology. So what that means, that's a lot of words to say, it catches hackers on networks. So it's a piece of software that I started writing in the late 90s, 1998, right at the end of the year. And I released it as an open source project, so I gave it away for free, and it got so popular so quickly that I started a company around it called Sourcefire, and that turned into a big success story.
How did you decide to open source, firstly, I've got to question that one. Why open source? Why did you decide to give it out? I mean, you could have just kept it, you could have been jealous and just had it as yours. Why did you choose that route?
So, back in 1998, basically, there was life before Snort and life after Snort. Life before Snort, I was just Joe Blow engineer, and I was learning cybersecurity in the way that I was teaching myself, because in the 90s, you had to teach yourself, was by building tools.
I remember.
Right. You were there, remember?
You got the gray up here, down here.
I was writing my own tools, and I wanted to write a cross-platform packet sniffer, so I started screwing around writing this piece of software that I called S. And
why S?
Because it's a sniffer, right?
Less typing too.
Right, less typing. It's all short names. People used to read my source code. They'd be like, I had this thing called IDX in a lot of my functions. It's like an indexing pointer. And one guy one day was complaining. He's like, IDX stands for I don't explain. Anyway, I decided to release this open source because in 1998. Linux had kind of emerged from the primordial ooze and was making a lot of momentum. And there was a lot of, if you remember, the Cathedral and the Bazaar writings were out there about the model of doing open source and why it's a superior method for getting software out there and having community-driven software as opposed to coming out of the software houses and things like that. So I read all the rhetoric, and I thought, well, maybe it'd be fun to release this thing. Maybe I'll get a few downloads. I'll get a couple emails. It'll be, nice rainy days and weekends projects. So I, decided to release it, and then, thought maybe if this thing is really good, maybe a few people will see it and it'll be something I can put on my resume. I wrote this little thing called Snort, and I had 10 users and it was great. And I released it, and the first release I got a few emails, and then second release a few more, and I ended up doing, well, the fun thing about it, so I was developing software at that time for, normal professional organizations, and it was like, there's a process, and you get the thing out there, and I was doing it for the government, and, there'd be like, it could be weeks or months before you heard from the customer that you were building software for, and then the open source stuff, you got it out there and you got feedback immediately, and I was like, ooh, it was like catnip. So I just started doing releases every couple of weeks. I did 23 releases of Snort the first year it was out.
Wow.
Yeah, so like every 2 weeks I was just kicking out another version.
Wow.
And featuring.
You were doing Agile before this was such a thing.
Exactly. Very trendy. Anyway, so yeah, it just took off, and then 20 months later, I saw a survey from the SANS Institute, which is a big, postgraduate IT training institute, that it was a multiple choice question: check all the intrusion detection systems that you use. And Snort was on the list, all the commercial systems were on the list, and it was checked 92% of the time. And I was like, wait a second.
Wow.
I've got a lot of users out there.
92%.
That's when my little evil Grinch brain started saying, wait a second, there could be money here. If I can figure out how to get people to pay for something that's free, I could, turn this into something.
Stepping back just a little bit, why a packet sniffer? What was interesting about that specific project?
Well, it's because you can see how the internet works, right? So you can see the protocols flying by on the network, and you could learn the protocols, you could read the packets and really see what was going on. So simple stupid stuff like you'd see usernames and passwords or snoop email and things like that, but you could also like debug problems with software, and you could debug problems with the network, and you could really fundamentally see how things worked. And if you had exploits, compromise tools and things like that, you could fire them across the network and observe them going by. And you start putting the pieces together. Well, if I can see it, if I can figure out a way to get the computer to see it, then that'd be really interesting. But Snort was originally written just to monitor my home network while I was at work. So I'd go to work during the day, and I was on a cable modem, so I thought it'd be interesting to just record all the traffic that's coming to my network when I'm not using it. And so I did that, and then very quickly I was like, oh, that's interesting. I would like a notification whenever this kind of thing shows up or that kind of thing shows up. And that started kind of the drumbeat.
Were you able to find net new exploits, or from your perspective, new exploits that other people were using? You're like, that's the thing that they're doing that are compromising things. Were you just logging everything, or was it entirely signature based at the beginning, or?
Oh yeah, it was entirely signature based. At first I was logging everything. It was just, you could use it as a sniffer or a packet logger.
Right.
So if you've ever looked at the Snort documentation, there's this getting started file that's in there called usage. That's essentially, it's a thing that I wrote a long time ago, and it talks about the three core modes of Snort. One is packet sniffer. It'll just dump the packets to the screen, and you can see them going by. Number two,
extremely useful for debugging.
Right, exactly. Right, because I wrote it for me to debug software. And then number two was packet logger, so you could record the packet dumps to disk. And then number three was intrusion detection mode, and that's what Snort became famous for. But yeah, for me, I was using it for anything I wanted to do for looking at network traffic, and I was just fascinated by how networks worked. Like, my background's in computer engineering, so for me, it was this complex system, and I really wanted to understand it. And then you can see these attacks going by. So we didn't so much find new attacks and things like that, but you could start recognizing the fingerprints of tools on the network by looking through the traffic dumps, things like that, scanners and exploitation tools and toolkits and things like that. You could see it like once you knew what you were looking at.
Eventually that is what they ended up using, was something just like that to identify, oh, this is a weird anomalous packet. I didn't recognize this. Why are these weird flags turned on?
Oh, yeah.
And then that's so anomalous, it's worth digging into and trying to figure out what it is. So why then, if you were on this open source kick, did you decide, well, I want to close source that again, or I want to bring it all back?
Well, I didn't close source it. I left it open. Snort's still open and free to download today.
Yeah, but you went...
But I commercialized it. Well, that's different. Let's not confuse, selling with installing, right?
Okay, yeah.
So the thing was that there came a point where I was working on Snort so much. So on the back of Snort, I got recruited to go work at a startup. I worked at that startup for almost a year. The startup kind of fell apart, and I left. And when I came out, I I told the world, the Snort mailing list, my world, that I wasn't working at this company anymore, and email me here, and everybody knew what that meant. So, like Marty's on the street, so all of a sudden I had a lot of job offers in my hand, and I had to figure out what I wanted to do with myself. And so I had options to go to other companies. I actually had one company try to buy Snort from me and hire me on, and then I.
How much for? Do you remember?
It was like $250,000 in 2000.
That's a good walking around.
$250,000, yeah, plus like $1 million worth of their stock. But that company never really did well.
Right.
So,
well, that's because they didn't have Snort.
Exactly. I was looking at all that, and I was like, well, I could go do any of these things. But the thing that I learned working at the startup was, if you really want to make money in the startup game, you've got to be one of the first 10 employees. And, you could also just start your own company. And, there's a whole spectrum of, success and failure that you can potentially achieve on that journey. So I started kicking around ideas for, well, if I wanted to get people to pay me money for this, how do I get people to pay for something that's free? And I want to keep it free. Like, I want people to continue to use it for free. I've got this great community of enthusiastic users, so I want to keep all that. But I want to also have the ability to monetize on the people who have kind of these deeper problems that we get into. And what I kind of observed by interacting with Snort users and things like that, and seeing the tools that were being written kind of as helpers for Snort and things like that, was that Snort on the small scale solved problems. So you could download Snort, get it up and running, and detect hackers breaking into your network, and you could deploy 2 or 3 of them, and it was kind of something that a single human being could do. But as soon as you tried to scale it, Snort on the large scale caused problems, and the problems that it were causing were different than the ones that it solved. And the ones that it were causing were essentially issues around manageability, scalability, performance, automation, and support.
Yeah, it was a job creator.
Right, exactly. And I was like, you know what? You could get people to pay for those 5 things: manageability, scalability, performance, automation, and support, while leaving it open, so you get the enthusiastic community, but you build a framework around it that can go to the people who have the scaling problem. No, those guys are large enterprises who have lots of money. And right now they're using all the commercial solutions that are out there, like from Cisco and ISS and things like that. And I was like, I think you could make money doing this. So I decided I was going to build a company to do it.
Was this before or after Red Hat? Because they have kind of a similar model. It's like, it's an open source, you can download it, anyone can use it, but yeah, do you really want to be doing that when you're at enterprise level? Like, you need the support.
Yeah, so Red Hat was selling more of a services model, whereas I was actually doing a product, we're building hardware product for you. So it wasn't, so what was different than Red Hat's kind of revenue model and things like that. I'm a guy who likes to build products, so I was like, how could I turn this into a product company? And what I came to find was nobody had really pulled that off before. And also the gathered intelligence of all the very experienced people that I talked to about building software companies thought it was a really bad idea.
Did they?
Oh yeah. Like I was not celebrated for bringing this idea to market originally. People were like, "This is stupid. That'll never work. Nobody's going to pay for stuff that's free, Marty."
So the punchline of this joke is then Cisco acquired your company.
Yes.
For $2.7 billion.
Yeah, that's a lot of cabbage.
So not 250,000 or whatever it was, a couple orders of magnitude larger.
Yep.
Firstly, is that a little bit of egg on their face? Do you feel like no one really saw what you saw? I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, well, a lot of people didn't, as you said, they didn't celebrate your idea, and clearly they were the ones who were wrong.
Yeah, well, it's a new idea. Can you get people to, is there that pent-up demand for the 5 things that are external to the process? Can you do, it's called the open core model now. Can you do the open core model in a way that's, for me, as I was thinking about it, ethical to the user base of all the people who built the notoriety and the popularity of Snort, while at the same time serving a real need that customers have. I'm not just charging rent. I'm actually bringing value add to the product.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, what I think today, the reason for kind of the poo-pooing was that most people didn't have the opportunity to think about it for long periods of time. You get struck in the face with, here's a new idea. And you're either kind of prepared for it or you're not. And if you're not prepared for it, it sounds weird and, one of the things that I think is uniquely available to young people kind of in their 20s and early 30s is the ability to focus on problems for long periods of time. That really unlocks your ability to really deeply consider a problem that you want to solve and come up with a real solution for it. And it gets rarer and rarer as you get older because, of course, your career and family and all the other stuff start taking up all your time. So your ability to set aside an entire weekend so you can sit there and mull over, can I get people to pay money for a free thing? Well, if I did this, this, and this, stack those up and then mull it over in your head and look at the problem from a lot of angles and then be able to consider the pros and cons and things like that. I like to think about things for a very long time before I pull the trigger on them, but when I do pull the trigger, I have thought about them for a very long time. So I've got a whole thesis and I've got a whole model that I've already baked up. So then I go to a guy who's been working in Silicon Valley for 20 years and I say, hey, I want to do this. And it's an idea that nobody else has really pulled off or tried before, and they hear it and they're like, well, that's dumb. Why wouldn't you do it this way? This is like the way the whole world's been working for decades. So just do it that way. I was like, well, no. I've got because I got this free thing and I want people to want to buy it. So yeah, it was. I don't really consider it to be like an egg on your face. I mean, some of the potential investors maybe could have had a little more imagination, but I think a lot of people have, unless you're in the business of like recognizing net new ideas for kind of their potential for brilliance, which is kind of the venture capital world, or failure, which is the other extreme.
Spectacular failures.
Right, exactly. Cratering. Unless
you're
you're
somewhere beyond zero.
Right, exactly. It's going to be like this, or is it going to be like this, right? Unless you're like in that business, I think it's pretty hard to recognize when there is a new and really kind of useful idea that's emerged, right? So I don't blame people. I mean, I had the unfair advantage of having thought about what this way I was going to solve this thing for literally months before I brought it up to anybody.
That's a funny thing. I've never heard anyone say this before, and I did the exact same thing. And some people were like, "Oh, you must be so cool in your house, all these screens everywhere." Picture hacker layer or whatever. And I'm like, if you were to come into my office on an average day, I'm probably staring at the wall doing literally nothing. Because what I'm actually doing is this massive architectural thing in my head, or I'm trying to fit all these pieces together. And some of it might be business issues or legal issues or sales issues or whatever, but it's like it all stems from some technology decision that you're going to have to make somewhere way upstream. And you can really screw these things up, so you kind of have to think through the whole thing. And so I might spend 10 times the amount of time thinking about something as I actually do hands on keyboard. Like it's not very dramatic.
Yeah, right. It's not like in the movies with like the screens of code flying by and stuff like that. It's like you're just sitting there like,
I mean, I have the screens that do the crazy things, but they're illegible. You still have to have some sense on top of all of that. And so.
Yeah, it's funny. I claim it, and it's true. I do a lot of my best thinking, like in the shower.
No, me too.
When you're on autopilot, basically, and it frees you up to.
Yeah, and the white noise, it really helps.
Yeah.
I think I want to say it was Kissinger, maybe. I can't remember. Used to sit in a bathtub with a fan in the bath, which sounds very dangerous, but but for the white noise, and he thought, I'm pretty sure it was Kissinger. So one of them. But I like that concept in general of spending the necessary time to actually think through things, because so many people are snap decisions, and sometimes that is useful, but other times it's just a bad idea. You got to really think things through.
Yeah.
So when was that acquired?
2013.
Okay,
Yep.
So exactly 10 years earlier, I remember seeing a report from Gartner that said that the IDS is dead.
Right.
So what do you think about that?
I disagree. Allow me to retort. That was an interesting period. We duked it out with them kind of in public, which was maybe in retrospect not the best idea. But it's like you're taking food out of my children's mouths was my problem, and they're like, no, we think your technology is dead. It's like, and it was, and they kind of took it on the, they took the show on the road, and I was like, I'm not going to let this lie. And they were a little right, but the interesting thing about it is, so when they said that intrusion detection is dead, and then they laid out their reasoning, It was almost like, a doctor laying out a list of the symptoms, but not being able to name the disease. And the disease was really that we were operating intrusion detection technologies in these kind of context-free environments, and human beings were supposed to provide the context. So context in this case means stuff like, when you have an intrusion detection system, the way these things work, they're incredibly sophisticated computer science constructs on the one hand, but on the other hand, the way that they're operated is like caveman stuff. Because it's like, okay, we have 50,000 things that we can detect. Please select what you would like to detect. Okay, great. Well, there's no assistant for that.
Right.
You just have to sit there, this one and that one and that one, or maybe this pack and things like that, or it's Microsoft Tuesday, so here's the Microsoft Tuesday rules. And that is really terrible. So what ends up happening is people just turn everything on, and then you get this deluge of noise that comes out of the system. So
I remember that deluge.
Right, exactly. Well, and I'm partially to blame because I also, I built the caveman technology, right? So the problem that you run into is that, or the way to solve it essentially is to contextualize the environment. So tell me what I've got and how it should be defended, and then if I can do that in an automated fashion with, software, then you can all of a sudden start auto-selecting what you feel like you should run, and when an event comes out of the system, then you can do this kind of frontline thing that a human would normally do, which is the answer the question, how much do I care about this event versus these 45 events? And the way that a human does it is they look at the event, and they look at what it happened to, and then they figure out, can that thing be vulnerable to this attack? No. Now I've got 44 to go. Right. So you can do that with the technology too. So you can characterize everything, what it can and cannot be vulnerable to, instead of what it is and isn't.
That's smart.
Right?
Yeah.
So is and isn't versus can and cannot is a very different proposition. And what that means functionally is I can use this as a pre-filter to get rid of everything that you can't possibly be affected by. So we invented that at Sourcefire. And,
but you could still be alerted if you felt like it.
Yeah, the alerts were still there. We would just contextualize them. So we would set what we call impact flags and say, if it's impact 1, you care about this. If it's impact 2, we think that you can't possibly be vulnerable to it.
So, but it's useful information to know that you're under attack, even if it's not vulnerable, because they're not going to succeed this time, but maybe next time.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of background radiation on the internet, though. Don't forget all this kind of automated stuff just floating around out there.
Yes.
Yep. So that noise, people don't tune it out.
I think it's like 1.5 seconds before you'll get compromised if you have an unpatched box on the public internet, something like that.
Yep.
That's pretty crazy. So my part in this story, because I am always a part of these stories in some weird way, I was my very first time being a product manager, and my boss, his name is Chris Richter, awesome dude, I love this guy, kind of my mentor. He basically said, hey Robert, you go handle Gartner. I'm like, I don't even know what that means. I don't even know who you're talking about or what. And he's just figure it out. And so I got a hold of Gartner, and they're like, you should go to this Gartner conference or whatever. And I had never been to a Gartner conference, know nothing about it. So I show up, and I don't know, I'm probably 23 or something, no business at all telling business leaders what to do with their lives. But I was a security guy. I like tech, right? So they threw me in this room with, I don't know, I was probably the only person in my 20s there. Let's put it that way. Like everybody there was in their 40s, 50s, and on up. And Richard Steinen, who did that article, was there. And I saw him, and I'm like, I kind of recognized the name. I didn't know, I'd never met him before. I'm like, oh, you're the guy who wrote that thing about IDS. I'm like, I tend to disagree. He's like, why? And he kind of cornered me. He's like, why do you think that? And I'm like, well, it's kind of a complicated thing. It would probably take a while to explain. And he's like, no, let's go sit down. He literally sat me down, and I'm just like, oh shit, maybe I said the wrong thing. Maybe I should have just kept my mouth shut. Yeah. And I'm like, well, I think that, even if you wanted to claim it's dead, you're taking it out of context of where you can add it into SIMs and all this security information management systems, where it might be completely unuseful with its context. But once you add these other contexts, it becomes really useful.
Right.
So even if you wanted to claim it's dead, I still don't think you could, because it's going to play a part in all this other stuff, and I would never get rid of it because of that fact. Explained all the technology and why, and examples of where you could use it and stuff, and he's like, yeah, I had never thought about any of that. And so I'm like, well, that's not a good first impression of Gartner.
Yeah, well, it's the difference between having operational experience and not. And a lot of places didn't have very advanced programs, so they had all these IDSs out there that were just noisemakers, and you know, I can see where he's coming from, but he, the nuance was lost. And in response to Sourcefire, we invented a whole new technology that would auto-contextualize the network environment and get rid of the false positives and things like that. So we really boosted intrusion detection, but at the same time, we went out and built intrusion prevention technology as well. And then, you know, we duked it out in the industry for a few years and eventually rose to the top.
What do you think about like security orchestration and automation response as it relates to all this? Because here's the genesis of this question. I'm seeing more and more builds where if something bad happens, they don't care. They just blow it away and rebuild it. And they don't even really have, let alone IDSs, they don't really have any kind of security. They don't even have firewalls. They just have open ports, and that is it. Wow. They have like 2 open ports, maybe. 80 and 443, right. Maybe 80. Right. So like, where does all that kind of come together?
Yeah, well, so we're trying to automate the orchestration of the security infrastructure to respond in the face of, like, you know, whatever event you think is interesting. Mm-hmm. We did a lot of pioneering work on intrusion detection and prevention technology back in the Sourcefire days, and there was like an 80-20 principle of the people who would turn on actual blocking versus not, right? So like 80% of customers wouldn't turn on any blocking at all under any circumstances, despite the fact that it's Microsoft Tuesday and you've got, you know, just a straight up buffer, you know, UDP buffer overflow out there, and we can detect it and block it with 100% accuracy. They're like, we're not comfortable with that.
Yeah,
and they wouldn't turn it on.
Because they're worried that it's going to break other things.
Right, it's, you know, shut down the CEO's email, or, you know, knock over some database or something like that. So they wouldn't turn it on. So one of the guys that I worked with at Sourcefire, who then went on to Phantom Cyber, one of the first SOAR companies, he said basically, like, hardly any of our customers actually had automated response turned on ever. Mm-hmm. And there's a big trust issue, and the trust issue is there because, once again, it all gets back to contextualizing the events. Like, these events show up, and they try to connect the dots so they can automate the response, but there's an element of doubt in the organizations that are running it, or a lack of sophistication, or a lack of process to be able to curate the system properly, so they just leave it in notify mode and they never get to the actual response side of it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's good it's a good approach, like, mm-hmm. It's the right idea, but I think operationally the way that it gets used, it's not realizing kind of its potential.
Yeah, and maybe people are just allergic to the idea. It's just not, they're not comfortable with it.
Well, it goes all the way, but, you know, 1,000 years ago we made our IDSs talk to checkpoint firewalls, and, you know, people would turn it on for 5 minutes and the false positives would, like, blow up the firewall config, and then they'd turn it off and never turn it on again, right? So, you know, it's like Battlestar Galactica, don't trust the machine. Right.
Well, and there's a lot of sense to that. I ran into a similar problem with WordPress. I was talking with some of the very high-placed WordPress people, and like, well, how many WordPress installs have the automated stuff turned on, all the automatic updates? And they're like, maybe a fraction of 1%. Yep. Maybe. And they'd be surprised if it was even 0.01%. Yep. Like, it's very, very, very low. And I'm like, why? Why? It's so weird. It's so easy to turn on, and there really is no breakage. I mean, it doesn't really do that anymore. I mean, once upon a time, maybe that was a little sketchy, but now, unless you're doing something very weird on your side, you're going to be fine. And just, people are allergic to it.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, it's a behavioral thing. It's, you know, people get used to doing things one way, and then when you try to change them, like, people do not like change. One of the, you know, we sold Sourcefire for almost $3 billion, and, like, you know, there were a bunch of people who are like, why'd you do that? I really like working here. I don't want to work for this big company.
Wanted you to hold out for 4, is that what they wanted?
It's like, but we can all buy, you know, Maseratis or whatever, you know, it's like, but, like, you know, this is a great outcome by any measure. This is like a great outcome, and people are like, but I like this culture. I like how we do things here. I like, you know, this is the place that I love working. So why would we change that, even for a gigantic, you know, sum of money?
Well, there's some sense to that. I mean, how much would you pay to have the best culture in the world? You know, so.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting point. You know, like, under what conditions do you make a decision to pull the trigger on something like that? Because you're changing a lot of people's lives, both positive and negative. Like, positively, the financial windfall and things like that. Negatively, the change in kind of their working life and whether or not they last at the new organization. I thought Cisco was actually a good home for Sourcefire.
Yeah, I think so too.
In terms of decent cultural match, and like Cisco's a very nice company to work for. They're very good to their people.
There's only going to be one of them or Checkpoint or one of the similar big firewall companies that's natural home.
Yeah, exactly. So it made a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. And there were some competitive pressures that were kind of weighing on us at the time. We were a public company. Palo Alto and FireEye were both coming roaring out of the gates, and they had just tremendous amount of financial backing and no expectations of profitability anytime. And like, we're a public company, like there are expectations.
Right.
So like our ability to free up cash flow to be able to fight this two-front war was complicated, and it was things like that. And the Cisco thing just made a ton of sense.
So what about things like DPI and encrypted traffic, and how does that all kind of play into your world?
Yeah, well, so that's a complicated topic. All right. So obviously did a lot of work in DPI. That was kind of my claim to fame for a couple of decades. But we did start recognizing, even before Sourcefire got picked up by Cisco, there was kind of a storm on the horizon, and there's two problems that have been coming down the pipe that are getting harder and harder to ignore now. One is how corporate networks are kind of dispersing to the cloud. So this is kind of gets to what we talk about in Netography these days. But dispersion is a real problem from a DPI standpoint because the way deep packet inspection works is you've got to be in a place on a network where you can inspect the traffic going back and forth. And if the network spreads across multiple cloud providers and multiple physical locations, you've got a real problem deploying actual sensing capability where you need it. You've also got a problem if you need to have this capability with ephemeral workloads and things like that, getting capability when you need it. So where you need it, when you need it, turned into a real problem. And then, especially now, encryption is a bigger and bigger problem. And it was a hassle. Like 10 years ago, it was a hassle. We had SSL decryptors and things like that we could put out there. 5 years ago, more of a hassle. Today, a huge problem. Because in the cloud, for example, if you want to decrypt SSL traffic, you either have to be on the workload itself and instrument that thing with an agent, or you have to pay the computational cost, which is hefty, to be able to break the crypto or do all the key management. And then you've got privacy and compliance issues that you've got to deal with and things like that to be able to inspect this traffic stream that 99.999% of it is not going to have anything interesting in it, right?
Yeah.
So these twin problems are kind of where things are going, right? So things are going more and more to the cloud, although on-prem is not going away. We've seen it over and over again in major enterprises, especially where you have some companies that are born in the cloud, but like major banks and other big organizations with big deployed fielded stuff like retail or aerospace or whatever, these are never going to be 100% cloud companies. And the security tooling isn't keeping up with the architecture, basically. They have some cloud stuff, or maybe they even have a lot of cloud stuff, but they've got security architectures that were imagined literally 20 plus years ago, which is appliances with central managers and license keys and software that has to be curated and updated and policy managers and all this stuff. And now it's Microsoft Tuesday, and the donuts must, time to make the donuts, right? The architecture that we've been imagining and building for the last 25-ish years doesn't really work with the way networks are operating anymore. And there's been a lot of, people aren't moving the ball forward. That's basically why I started working again. After I left Cisco, I took a year off, then the pandemic hit, and eventually I got asked to come run this company. And one of the things that got me off the couch basically was the architecture of networks has changed, and nobody's moving the ball forward on the security architectures to match. And that's what.
Well, how did it all play in the COVID timeframe? I mean, everything just. We once sort of had a network, kind of, and now it's just boosh, it's everywhere.
Well, remember almost exactly 3 years ago, so it's March 2020, we're all hanging out, everybody's seeing the stuff on the news like, is this going to be a problem? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, everybody go home. Everybody go home, just get your job done, do what you got to do, we'll be back in 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks was like actually 6 weeks, and then it's actually 6 months. So people just kept getting their job done, and they just stood up infrastructure wherever they needed it, whenever they needed it. And one of my favorite CISO quotes since I started working again is, This guy said, the only thing that keeps me up at night is I got 1,000 developers working from home and they all have credit cards. So they've got all this stuff that's everywhere, and like they've really poor understanding in a lot of cases of exactly what they've got and what it's doing. So yeah, it's really interesting. My opinion, it is a total artifact of the pandemic. And now you can't put, the toothpaste doesn't go back in the tube. People are trying to get their hands around it, but like identifying what have I got, what is it doing, how's it changing, who owns it, do I actually have my hands around everything that is being used for this corporate, this enterprise network?
You don't.
Right, exactly.
I almost don't care who you are, you don't.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a major problem, and I kind of saw it, and I looked around the security industry, of which I've been a member for 20-something years, and I saw zero motion towards dealing with the problem that people actually have now. And a lot of admitting you've got a problem is the first step at getting past it. So admitting that our architectures don't really fit with modern network deployments and operation is not something that a lot of companies want to hear, because the big companies all have deployed sunk cost architectures that they would like the world to work with forever, and all they're doing is retrofitting and kind of chicken wire and duct taping solutions together to keep it going as long as they can until a disruptor shows up and basically sweeps them, sweeps those approaches aside.
You're preaching to the choir. I mean, the entire purpose of my previous company, Bit Discovery, now been purchased by Tenable, was finding all those weird assets that people don't know they have. And every once in a while you run into somebody who really believes they've got a handle on it. They're really like, no, I understand my network. And I have every reason to believe they've done a lot of work. And so it's not like a completely unjustified feeling. I'm like, okay, if I believed you, which I still don't, but if I believed that you had a really good handle on your network, I still don't believe that the company you're going to acquire tomorrow, you have a good handle on them. And so once you think about the world in that context, now it's a different ballgame. You just don't get to choose what your architecture looks like. You inherit what you inherit. And you could fix it slowly over time, but you're not going to just rip and replace overnight. You got to be careful. Otherwise, you just break everything.
Right, exactly. Yeah, everybody's, this infrastructure, like there's dependencies built on it. One of the points that I make when I'm talking about we call this the atomization of the network.
I was going to ask you about this.
Yeah, so one of the points that I like to make is not only did everything disperse, but then everybody started building dependencies between all of it, right? It's not like I'm just going to go stand up my app over here. I've been set loose and my job is get this app up, so I'm working on it. But also, by the way, the database that I'm leveraging for this app to work is actually still in the on-prem environment. I'll just connect them and we'll figure it out later because I'm just getting my job done. So all these dependencies get built, and then what happens? Well, now it's like, okay, we got to unwind all these dependencies to be able to change how we're doing things. And of course,
it's a mess.
That's not happening anytime soon.
I mean, so the way I see it, I work largely in the web side of the world, mostly network, but we're bedfellows, we hang out. It would be like the APIs. It seems like to me the APIs are the one thing that it just seems like no one's got any sort of handle on at all. Like we connect to this API over here. I'm like, okay, well, what is that API? Well, it says that it does this. Okay, do you have any proof that it does that? What happens if it goes down? What happens if it gives you bad data? What happens if it goes up and down randomly? Like, what sort of monitoring do you have around this API? How do you handle the credentials? Do you roll your credentials? How do you roll your credentials? And just you start asking any questions about APIs, and people go, whoa, 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 whoa! It's just an API, buddy. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, it's like, I like the API.
It's like you need an entire architecture around your API, and everyone just all they do is call a curl script, and that's done, and that's the end of the story. And they just expect it's always going to be there, it's always going to be up, and I think that's literally the last time anyone ever thinks about that API, and it's unless something bad happens.
Until it breaks, right?
Until it breaks. So I think you're spot on. I think this is a really intricate web that we've created, no pun intended. It's not the interweb, but it's some weird, just everything's sort of touching each other in very dangerous ways that we just haven't spotted yet.
Yeah, totally. Like the amount that people don't know about their networks. I mean, we go into environments where it's like, So in Netography, we're doing flow analysis. So it's a extremely low-touch, frictionless kind of thing that we're doing, and I'm not necessarily promoting that approach, but what we see when we go places and we just start looking at like what is actually going on in this environment, like what have I got and what is it doing? It's like, well, you got a bunch of Bitcoin mining going on over here. People are like, what?
Like, you're not supposed to find that. The one guy's over there sweating.
No surprise.
That's not worth anything anymore anyway.
Right.
But, okay, so tell me about Netography. Like, how did that all come to be? You were an investor at one point, right?
Yeah, I was an investor. I was an early advisor to the team there. There's a lot of interesting backstory here, because it actually, the idea for Netography, in my mind, stretches back all the way to the Sourcefire days when I started thinking about this problem of, hey man, like networks are moving to the cloud, but they're dispersing. So I still have on-prem, but I also have cloud, and now encryption is becoming more of a problem, things like that. So I started thinking about approaches to solve that problem all the way back in the misty days of the early 2010s. And then Cisco acquisition happened, and I went there and did the chief architect thing and was doing, trying to come up with a unified architecture for Cisco, which is always a hilarious
good luck.
Project. And then,
just when you think you got it nicked, there's another product.
Exactly. So anyway, I eventually left there and took some time off, and then I got pandemic hit, so everybody's sitting around on their couch in their sweatpants, like tapping away on their laptops and stuff like that. And I was advising these startups, including Netography. And they eventually got to the point where they were ready to go to market, and they asked me if I'd like to come run the show. And
so what brought your eye to them specifically?
A mutual investor connected us originally, but the idea that they were working on essentially. So all the way back into the 2009, 2010 timeframe, I started to see kind of the effects of encryption, and now people are moving workloads to the cloud and stuff like that. So how am I going to do intrusion detection stuff in the cloud? Well, it can't really run packet sniffers or inline or do decryption in the cloud, so that's not great. So like there were these problems that were stacking up, and I was like,
how do you even do that with serverless compute? What does it even mean?
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of problems.
S3 buckets. What is it? How are you going to do that?
Oh, yeah, I know. And so I started looking at it and started trying to imagine, like, if I wanted to be able to have a kind of a multi-mode capability where it didn't matter if you were in the cloud or on-prem, what would that look like? And my conclusion was, you would have to do metadata analysis, and the only metadata sources out there that's real-time outside of packets themselves is NetFlow data. And there've been a bunch of NetFlow companies in the security industry or around it over the decades, but none of them have been like this, like really head and shoulders success. And there's a lot of reasons for that. NetFlow is relatively low fidelity data source all by itself. And we didn't have the context models back then that we have now. We didn't have cloud resources to be able to build cloud scale analytics or ingest and things like that. So a lot of the precursor technologies to the approach of using metadata, they were the right idea, but the technology platforms weren't kind of evolved enough to really do it at the scale that you needed to do it, have it largely usable by any enterprise, as opposed to just the ones that were the most switched on, that had the capacity to implement this stuff. So anyway, so there was kind of that stuff. There was also, I was really interested in how cloud EDR technologies worked. So there is a method to my madness here. So we bought a company called Immunet at Sourcefire, and Immunet was a cloud EDR. So the way it worked is you have an agent that rides on your device. It collects metadata about the processes that are running on the device, ships them up to a cloud detection backend. That's where the actual magic happens, and if it sees something that's interested in, it signals back down to the agent and says, oh, don't let that process run, or whatever. So the cool thing about it, the old days we had to move definitions down to desktops, and then the definitions had to be updated every day for the new viruses that are coming out and things like that. Well, in this model, it was like, you don't have to do any of that. I can update the cloud once. My entire deployed global footprint across all of my customers is protected simultaneously. That's really powerful, right? Yeah. So the engineer in me is like, if I wanted to, could I do that on the network? Is there a way, like, how would I do that? If I wanted to do that function on the network, what would it look like? And once again, it was like, it's got to be metadata because I can't ship all the packets up to a cloud backend. I have to have information about the communications on the network, but not the communications themselves. And I need to wrap it with context because that's the only way to enrich the data sufficiently. And I was like, that would be really cool. We should build that. And then we didn't. And then we didn't build it at Cisco either. And then Barrett and Dan, the guys who built Netography, without ever talking to me, built it themselves. And then we got connected, and I was like, oh, that's cool. You guys are on the right path. And then they asked me to run it. I was like, well, of course.
Oh.
Yeah.
So you just volunteered. You're like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. I mean, it took a little bit of going around, but obviously,
Okay,
well, I had to look at it. I was like, what are we going to compete with? And this is a pretty different approach. And is the market ready for it? You got to ask yourself all those questions. But I sat there and I thought about it for a few months, and then I was like, yeah, we can do this.
So how does it sort of differ from other NetFlow data? Is it just that it's got this better enrichment layer? Is that the major feature? Or
So it's pure cloud. There's no hardware or software to deploy. So it's a SaaS play. It has a very, it has a SaaS licensing model. So we license by the rate at which you ingest flow data and how long you want to keep it around for. And what that means practically is if you want to stand up additional capability elsewhere in your network, you can just do it. You don't have to call us. There's no license keys. There's no management infrastructure to integrate with. There's no policies to push. You just spin up your data source and you're up and running. So it's really cool and flexible because you can stand up.
Well, especially because you don't know what your traffic's going to be from minute to minute. You have no idea.
Oh, right, exactly. Or you could have an incident in some part of the network that you haven't instrumented yet, and you're like, ooh, man, I really need to see what's going on over there. Just point the data sources at Netography, and away we go. And you can be up literally in minutes if you got the passwords, the right things to turn on flow. That's really all that's required. So you start seeing what's going on. So that's really powerful. It doesn't care what environment it's operating within, so it can be applied equally to IT, OT, and cloud environments. It has a one language across all those environments, so we call it write once, detect everywhere. So it's really a powerful way of doing it, and then the user interface on it is built with, out of the box. It's not like your classic internet security, web-based spreadsheet like most products. This has graphs, it's got dashboard builders, you can use the language that the system has to define any kind of views you want to get into the data. It's got pivots and all sorts of stuff. So you can mine through absolutely huge data sets really quickly. So the cool thing about it is that I can get visibility into my environment so I can understand what I've got, what it's doing, and what's happening to it across any environment that I've got. It treats my entire network as a composite of its parts instead of, well, that's the OT group stuff, and this is the IT stuff, and this is the cloud. Well, this is AWS, and that's Azure, and we have different teams and different tools for all of those. And if there's an incident, then we'll get them all in a room and we'll try to figure out what happened. We treat it all the same. We see it all the same. So it's really, is it a different approach? It's a different approach architecturally, and how it's built to go about its business, but I think it is the approach for what we call these atomized networks, because it doesn't care what your network looks like. It works the same everywhere, and it works on any network, cloud and on-prem, at the same time with one view across all of it. So it's, we feel it's a pretty radical departure from what's come before, and it gets away from deep packet inspection. It doesn't care about encryption. It's where you need it when you need it, and we're easy to work with.
So one of the things that a couple of my security friends have been talking about a lot is just reducing dwell time. Like, it really doesn't matter how you find it. It doesn't matter really when you find it, as long as basically the second it is found, they get kicked off the network. And ideally, the second they get caught is pretty early, so they don't get a chance to get footholds and start pivoting around and doing all the bad things they're going to do once they get access to the bad things.
Right.
So do you have any sort of idea and success stories and like how you guys are managing that or trying to push in that direction? Or
Yeah, so the way our technology works, so we're not so much a threat detector as a compromise detector. So like Snort was a threat detection technology. It can detect, you just got hit by SQL Slammer, or you just got hit by Log4j. And for many organizations, the original thought was, we need to identify which attack you got hit by, because this is reflective of the TTPs that are out there, which will influence your response and so on and so forth. But the number of organizations out there that are actually capable of figuring out, this TTP is in play and I need to differentiate my response based on that versus the companies that are out there like, oh, that box just got hacked, repave it. Just like reimage it and away we go.
Right.
Right? Like the number of companies who are actually prepared to do a very sophisticated response to an incident is a very small number of companies. There's everybody else who's just getting their jobs done. Right?
Yeah, a few banks, they kind of have it down because it happens occasionally and all hands on deck. I remember Visa was really amazing at this particular thing. They would just go over to unplug it immediately.
Yeah.
They don't care what. If they can't fix it within 4 hours, and now I think the number's way, way, way down from 4 hours, but back then it was, just rip it right out of the wall.
Yeah. So, so the question is, do I really need to have this really high fidelity detection to inform a very sophisticated differentiated response, or do I just need to say, hey, this thing's been compromised? And I can see that by, its behaviors changing on the network.
New anomalous activity.
Right. It's just like, this is a database server, and now it's now it's been sending out a lot of DNS traffic suddenly, very large DNS packets to someplace in the on the other side of the world.
Cool.
Yeah. So we can see that stuff happening as it happens, and then we can signal in real time and basically tell your infrastructure, hey man, this box has gone off the rails. Do something about it.
Gotcha. So how does this fit in with like the ephemeral nature of a lot of, so like AWS for instance, they have this ephemeral machines that were they're there 1 minute, they're gone, and then there's another one. They're it's up, it's down, it's up, it's down. You can't even tell, you can't say reliably what its IP address is even because it'll be gone by the time you write it down.
Yep. Serverless or lambdas and things like that.
Yeah, it's like a time of check versus time of use issue across the entire network. It's really kind of terrifying how hard it is to instrument environments like that.
Right. Yeah, so for us, in those kinds of things, it would depend on how they're set up, but if you're like export the VPC context when the thing is instantiated, we would get that context, we would see the activity, and when it goes away, it goes away. So we would essentially tag the traffic that we see along with the VPC context and be able to do our analysis despite the fact the thing doesn't exist anymore. And then the question is, well, how much, if the machine is gone, how much does it matter whether or not it was hacked in the 13 seconds that it was active?
Well, I mean, the answer to that is, was it hacked or was the database behind it hacked? And
well, that's exactly like, did they hop?
Right, did they hop?
And is that database, is the database also ephemeral, or is it like something that's sitting there and these ephemeral workloads are essentially being load balanced across the demand?
It's gone from here, but it's over here, and
right.
It's still beaconing out. It's just now you lost fidelity.
Right. Well, you lose fidelity on the initial attack vector, but you still have the anomalous activities that are going on the database cluster. Right?
And the new one, and the new IP address that popped up. Yeah, it's just like this weird, tricky problem where you kind of have to now connect your cloud stuff into these systems to. It's like I'm over here now. It's like
yeah.
There's nothing static anymore.
The Laceworks guys would say, well, we just have to instrument the apps themselves and then build the graph, and that's how you do it. And sure, that's what you could do, but you got to deploy agents now. Yeah. So it's like pick your poison, I guess.
Yeah, another group of my friends, maybe it was yesterday, they were all just going back and forth. It's like, oh no, it's agents, now it's network, now it's agents again, now it's networks again. Oh, we have crypto, so we have to go back to this.
Yeah.
It's like this evolving. So what's the answer? Like, is it the network? Is it agents? Like, what are we going to land on?
I mean, it's complicated. It's complicated. I think the answer is probably going to be some. There is no. You've been working in security as long as I have. Turns out there's no actual answer to the problems, right? So
it's kind of a trick question,
right? I think that having the fundamental capabilities there to be able to do things like observe the network environment, even if you have like a super ephemeral segment. That's not going to be the totality of your network. It's going to be an area of your network. Yeah. So the ability to still instrument and observe the entirety of your network environment to see, oh, this database cluster is acting funky, and now all of a sudden, it's connecting to the finance network. Okay, well, that's not great. Well, if you concentrate on, well, we were just doing agents, and the agents didn't show us that, or we were just concentrating on network, and we couldn't really tell when things were going off the rail because we didn't have the right fidelity, those kinds of things.
Okay, and what about BYOD?
BYOD, yes. Well, so there is the question of when the users are all remote and working from home, how do you see their activities, especially if all they're doing is touching SaaS apps?
So it's not, I mean, so during COVID, one of my favorite anecdotes about this, I think it was Kareem Hijazi who said this. He's like, we saw this massive spike in these old pieces of malware as soon as COVID happened. And they were trying to figure out what happened. And basically what happened is the IT guys were down there going, we got to give out laptops right now. So they just went to their stacks and stacks of old machines that are running like slow and, you know, something got pop-ups or whatever. And they're just, you know, flinging them out. And so that's bad. But what's even worse is like, oh, well, I've got this old clunky desktop under my, you know, under my thing. I'm just going to turn it on. It's all dusty and messed up. But hey, it still boots.
I can do email, right? Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's there's a lot of complexity that goes, like, once you get into the home remote user world, it's like, okay, are you doing a VPN thing where everybody's VPNing back to the mothership and you're backhauling your traffic, or is it, you know, just people from home accessing SaaS apps that you don't have visibility into, or maybe you're exporting the logs out of the SaaS apps into some log analytics platform or just dumping it into Splunk, God forbid, or whatever, and trying to do it that way. That is an area that we're kind of scratching our heads about right now. Like, you know, it's what we're doing. This is a 100% answer for everything, right? It's a pretty good answer for we think for kind of modern enterprise architectures. But if you start looking at, like, so our coin of the realm is flow data. If you start looking at how do you get net flow data off of a Windows box or a Linux box or a Mac OS box, well, the answer is not obvious. Like, there aren't free tools to do it. There are very few even commercial tools to do it. So if you wanted to package that data up and export it to, you know, our back end, you're going to have to do some work, or maybe we have to write an agent to get it to you. There we go.
I love that question because there is no answer.
Right.
It's both. I mean, you gotta. The answer is both.
Yeah.
But it's dependent upon the situation, and that's why it's such a tricky question. Yeah. Well, I mean, the only thing I come back with is maybe like a Citrix or something. You know, it's like, I don't really care what you're running on this computer. I'm just not going to trust you with anything. So here's this agent, back to agents, but this agent is basically a VPN tunnel or RDP sort of thing that allows you to connect to these remote systems, and then you can monitor it again. Now it's back on your network, and you have full visibility, and bad things happen, and you can spot it really quickly. But without that, if people are using cloud apps, you know, Google Mail or whatever, you know, you're not going to see anything.
Yeah, you see very, very little.
It's all going to be gone.
Yep. Yeah, it's really, it's a very complicated problem because the fan out, to, you know, use an engineering word, an electrical engineering word, the fan out is very high very quickly. So, like, the number of different scenarios that you can run into that you have to figure out some sort of instrumentation for, it very quickly gets kind of untenable. Yeah.
No pun intended.
Yeah, right.
So you had a blog post about the Tower of Babel problem.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Sure. Okay. So this is, so we have this acronym that we coined at Netography to talk about atomized networks, to talk about the attributes of atomized networks. They're what we call DEED environments, and DEED stands for dispersed, ephemeral, encrypted, and diverse. So the Tower of Babel problem is related to the last D there, the diversity issue. And the diversity issue on networks is that essentially in many enterprise networks, especially, you'll have an IT environment, your on-prem IT environment, you'll have a multi-cloud environment, and a lot of them you also have an OT environment. And in all of those different environments, you're going to have different tools. So maybe you'll have Palo Alto or Cisco in the on-prem IT environment, and then in the OT environment, you'll have like Clarity or Armis or something like that. In the cloud environment, maybe you'll be using like, you know, Wiz or some CWPP technology, or you know, you'll be living off the land and using Defender and Sentinel or CloudTrail or whatever. And I'm going to have different teams that operate those technologies. They have different policies that are enacted in different languages, and they have different eventing and different reporting. So when things happen, like, it's a mess very quickly. If an attacker lands and spreads laterally, like, you know, the Uber attack, they get in, they immediately go to the cloud properties, and they're, you know, by the time you find them, they're, you know, messaging you on Slack. And it's like, oh, well, that's super ugly.
Yeah.
Like that person really got around. So the Tower of Babel problem is essentially like we're almost literally building this Tower of Babel inside all of our enterprises, where I have these different teams that are using different tools that almost literally speak different languages to talk about the same problem. And we should recognize it for what it is and maybe not do that, right? So that's one of our kind of our thesis at Netography is, hey man, your network is actually, like, it's all bound together by IPv4 or IPv6 networking. You should treat your enterprise network as the composite of all of its components instead of a bunch of components that have to be observed and defended separately from one another. Because you are just building this gigantic problem for yourself by not treating it that way. Now, there are very specific cases where you might need very specific capabilities to defend, like the crown jewels and things like that. I get that, but for like broad applicability, thinking about all these things as very different things that have to have very different tools and techniques to protect them is maybe not the way to go, given the trend of how networking is going right now, in terms of its atomization and spread to kind of the four corners of the earth.
So what do I get rid of with Netography? I mean, they're surely going to replace something, some legacy technology.
Yeah, we are kind of observing that our customers are deploying us for whatever problem they're bringing us in for. A lot of multi-cloud visibility stuff, some kind of NDR-like functionality, although we are not an NDR. And what we're seeing as we get into customer environments, they're finding more and more use cases that the technology really addresses. So the Netography system is a platform. You can do a ton of stuff with it, but we concentrate on a very small set of use cases because you can't just roll into a customer and say, hey, Mr. Customer, we can see your entire network. What problem would you like to solve? Right? You have to roll in and say, we can do operational governance and compromise detection and threat hunting and discovery and mapping. And most enterprises have those problems, right? So that's all very cool. But once we get into these places, like the operators get real smart in a hurry because the technology is very accessible and it's also very easy to get up and running anywhere. So they're coming back to us now and they're like, you guys actually do 80% of what an NDR does, and you don't have any of the curation overhead that those technologies have. So we're going to let that thing end of life, and then we're just going to use you guys moving forward. Or we brought you in for multi-cloud visibility, and now we've had a compromise in one of our on-prem data centers, so you can be up and running today. So we're just going to deploy you. It would take us months to get appliances in here and get them running. So we're going to get you guys going. And they're like, oh, I can see what I need to see. Perfect. Let's replicate that across other data centers. So I kind of call it a yes and sale, where, you've got this, and you can also use us, and as you get used to it, you're going to find that you have less and less use for the old way of doing things. That seems to be what we're getting into. We do see some replacement stuff going on with older technologies, flow analysis tools, and some types of kind of IDS-like functionality, as well as we're getting brought in, like FICO is one of our big reference customers. They're using us for audit compliance internally. So they know that they used to throw all their data in a data lake and do reports, and it took hours to get the reports out. And now they have the data in Netography. They run a query in the system. They have the data in seconds. Their auditors are happy, and they get back to work. So it's pretty interesting, the use cases that we see customers really coming up with for the technology.
What kind of customers do you end up having? I mean, do you have this is our sweet spot, these are where we go for? Or?
Large enterprise right now. It's interesting though, across the large enterprise, we have a very diverse customer base. So we have an airline, large semiconductor manufacturer, software company, we have a few banks, we have one of the world's largest beverage companies, we have a shipping company, we have a water authority. So yeah, we have a very diverse customer set. And to me, that's really interesting because what that says to me is that this is broadly applicable. It's not just something the banking industry is going to use or just the tech industry is going to use. Everybody can use it. To me, as the business guy in me says, ooh, there's a large total addressable market here.
So how does this play in with zero trust? And I mean, can you wrap all that up? Well, and also, can you explain what zero trust is? Because I think a lot of people.
I don't think we have enough time.
I don't think a lot of people even know what it is.
Yeah. All right. Wow. So zero trust. The theory of zero trust is, hey, what if I trust nothing and then everything has to kind of prove itself anytime it wants to access resources that I want to control access to? That's the theory of it. The practical reality of it in a lot of cases is that we're going to take all of our trust issues and we're going to put them into one single basket. Mm-hmm. Then this is going to work perfectly, and we're never going to have problems with it, and then we'll just make everything rely on that. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot of the application. I'm being a little sarcastic, but not too sarcastic. I think a lot of zero trust is like outsourcing your trust to, one or a few, not exactly single points of failure, but you are putting very few eggs in one big basket to do it. The price that you pay for doing that is like the fundamental kind of operating principle of zero trust in a lot of cases is we're going to encrypt everything, and to unlock it, especially network traffic and disks, you have to authenticate your identity or whatever credentials you have to get access to XYZ. Well, for me as a guy who's been analyzing network traffic for the last 27 years, if you encrypt all my network traffic, it gets very hard to analyze. So
yes.
I'm not a super fan as a result of that because I think people have charged down this path without realizing the implications of what it's going to do to all this deployed capability that you put out there.
Agent. It'll be fine.
We just put agents out there forever. It's like I got 75 agents. But the idea of zero trust is that it's supposed to contain the quote unquote blast radius. If you get compromised because you need to have authenticated access to all the stuff and the infrastructure that can handle all of the assertions and things like that I am in fact who I am, there's roots of trust and things like that built into hardware. And the problem is that the weak part of the argument is that if you do in fact get compromised, if they compromise the authentication system, essentially the credentialing system, then you still have full access to everything, but you've actually blinded a lot of your infrastructure as a result of encrypting everything.
Oh, totally.
So hate to be that guy, but has anybody thought about what happens if this doesn't work very well? Like if it's poorly implemented or half implemented, because it is in a lot of places. And it's problematic because the price that you've paid to get there is like really reducing what can be seen. So from our standpoint, zero trust driving encryption to be this kind of pervasively present hurdle to understanding what's happening in your environment makes a metadata analytics platform like we've built here, like it becomes very obvious that if you're going to do that, then you've got to have something like what we've been doing because it's kind of the only game in town as far as like conceptually, how do you address these problems? If I need to have real-time visibility on what's happening at the network and everything's encrypted on the network, what's the path forward? Well, I need real-time metadata source, that's flow, and I need context about what's happening. So I can see these activities happening in the environment, and then I can marry them back to users and processes and locations and security groups and things like that. So I can start establishing like what are the patterns and operations that are normally happening around here, and how can I see things going off the rails?
Yeah, one of the things I don't like about zero trust is it implies you actually know where all your stuff is.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's like it's like,
but you don't.
Right, exactly. It's like data leak protection. It's like first take all of your data and register it with our system. It's like, excuse me, does anybody know where all their data is? And if they did, would they really need a DLP system?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Oof. Yeah, a lot of so I joke about agents in a different way. Yeah. It's like we'll install an agent on all our machines so we know where they all are. It's like I don't think you see the problem with that logic.
What if you didn't know where they all were?
I ran into this one customer one time, or potential customer. We didn't actually get them, and I'm actually fine with that because they're like, well, we don't use Amazon. We only use Azure. I'm like, great. Well, what about all these Amazon instances I'm looking at? They're like, well, we don't use Amazon. I'm like, but you do, and there it is. And they're like, well, we don't allow it by policy. I'm like, I know.
And yet here we are.
It was a very weird conversation. They were very convinced that they were right. I'm like, I don't know how to help you. It's a
like
mess.
To slide the sheet across the table.
So you have, I'm sure, some thoughts on where the industry needs to go in the next handful of years.
Sure.
That there's probably need to be some radical shifts in technology and maybe business processes. I'm not sure. Can you shed some light on where you think things are going?
Yeah. My biggest kind of drum that I'm banging these days, really in a lot of cases, is the fact that the architectures of the security infrastructure is really lagging the architectures of the environments that it's trying to protect. Now, all the cloud stuff, obviously, that's built for the cloud. There's a lot of cloud security vendors that are out there that are saying, well, the cloud is the beginning and end of networking, so we don't need to worry about all this goofy stuff on-prem. Like, nobody does that anymore and things like that. But the reality is that, of course,
it's all still there.
Especially major corporations, that stuff's all still there and it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, we did some basic analysis, and there's this big, everyone's moving to the cloud. They aren't. They're just also building in the cloud. They didn't get anything out of their old infrastructure.
No, I mean, especially once the pandemic hit, there was literally nobody to turn off the lights. It's like, well, the data center's still there, and you can't turn it off because I built all these dependencies for my apps that I built during the pandemic.
And half of those people left the job, and
right, nobody
really
knows
screwed.
What's going on, who's talking to what, all that stuff. Yeah, so I'm really pretty strident about the fact that the architectures that we're operating on are not well suited to the environments in which they are being operated. And there's so much sunk cost into the plant, essentially, especially at the biggest vendors that are out there, Cisco's and Palo Alto's and all the major players, that you're not going to see them make the kind of architectural, almost revolution that you need to get your hands around where networking is today. Like, this balkanization problem, this Tower of Babel problem, isn't just around visibility and control of trying to understand what I've got and what it's doing. There's other areas, like as you try to manage zero trust across an atomized network where I'm in multiple clouds, plus on-prem, plus OT environments, like, how does that work?
Plus mobile.
Plus mobile, how do you make that work across all of those things when you are just deploying separate solutions for each discrete area instead of considering them as a composite? And oh, by the way, there's nothing available that considers it as a composite, right? Like, we built this for our area of expertise where we know what we're doing, but we can see this balkanization exists across all these disciplines where the networks have atomized and none of the architectures of any of the solutions have kept up with the fact that, hey, if I have to manage each area of my network as a separate thing with a separate team, I'm actually not going to get better security. In fact, you could make the argument it's going to be worse. And you probably wouldn't be wrong.
So I'm assuming, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I guess you assume there's going to be some more consolidation of the markets.
Always.
Well, so I guess it's kind of a hybrid question, because last year, this time, we saw a massive decrease in valuations. I mean, really pretty crazy. And this year, almost exactly a year later, we're seeing a lot of the largest security companies missing earnings. And so I think that's just a ripple effect of the same problem. It just takes a while for the public markets to go through their pipelines and then miss their earnings and their earnings call, and that takes another several months or whatever. And then finally, you feel it, right?
Right.
So what happens? Where is the market going? Who's going away? Who's going to get bought? What do you think?
I think if it depends on a number of factors. So, for example, we're a Series A company. So we're wildly unprofitable with no expectation of profitability anytime soon, on the one hand. On the other hand, we do have a large number of very enthusiastic and very well-regarded investors who are out there who are willing to let us run and see where we can get. And the bet is that we have a very experienced team and we're going to figure it out. So there's a cadre of companies like that. There's a cadre of companies that are a lot farther along in their journeys and they're still not profitable. They've gone through 5 or 6 rounds of funding and they don't really have, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. I think some of those will start winding down or you'll see them shrinking and getting rolled up into PEs or, whatever. As well. You'll see probably a wave of acquisitions happen in the wake of the compressed valuations.
Yeah, I would assume so, right?
Yeah, of companies that are...
There's a lot of IP out there that just got to get sucked up.
Right, exactly. They're well positioned. They're at the point where it's close enough where you can bring them into a larger organization, get the go-to-market efficiencies, and turn it into a profitable business and things like that. What you don't want... no company's going to buy a fixer-upper for the most part, except maybe a PE firm that has a thesis for putting the components together, and you're on the right idea, but the organization and the tech has to be...
Or the people are just bad, or for whatever reason.
Yeah, right, exactly. So you'll see some of that stuff I'm sure happen as well.
Like Vista Equity, I think they're in that realm.
Yeah, but I don't see like this kind of wild paring down of the industry or anything like that. I mean, cybersecurity, for better or worse, it's plumbing, and the pipes are always leaking. So there's always customers out there. Yes, we're seeing budget slowdowns and compression and things like that, but unless there's a company that's very poorly funded and doesn't have like great kind of economics, almost every company is going to figure out a way to get through this period and see what's on the other side.
So what is it like having gone from, you were a CEO, then you're an investor, you're back to being CEO. I mean, do you just miss being at the butt of every joke, or
Exactly.
the one has to write all the checks?
So how much do you like getting clubbed in the head? Yeah, it's...
talking to the board on the other side of the table, that's just can't be that much fun.
It's not terrible. I get a lot of leeway because of the track record and things like that. And, we're usually... The cool thing about doing it now is that I understand the game I'm playing. I didn't understand it 20 years ago very well. I knew the tech and I knew what I was building, but like the ins and outs of operating the company and managing the board and all those things, like getting ahead of problems. So when you don't be gross and go have the board meeting during the board meeting. You got to have the board meeting before the board meeting.
Yes.
All those kinds of things.
Yeah, pre-sell.
Right, exactly, and like understanding what their concerns are, so you can address them appropriately and things like that. So, I feel well, kind of prepared for a lot of that. I was talking to one of my Sourcefire. Coworkers / mentors from when we were building the company, and I was talking to him about coming and being the CEO at Netography, and he said, are you sure you want to be a CEO? Are you sure, you've done it before, do you really want that responsibility?
You don't remember how much you got beat up. You
right,
just
exactly.
can't remember.
Yeah. And my point to him
it's
was...
like startup amnesia.
Oh yeah, it's like having a baby, right? My point to him was, look, if not me, then who? Like, who else is at the, I'm at the point in my career where, like, I know way more about the tech than most CEOs do, and I know the market that we're going into, and I know, the right people, and, can build the team and do all the things that need to be done to build a great business. I can do all those things now that I was kind of sketchy on when I started Sourcefire, and I was better at the end, but I had a great team at Sourcefire at the end as well, who made me a better CEO by kind of making my life easy because they were excellent. But now we're in this new mode, and it's new technology and new people and things like that. And we have some of the Sourcefire team, but we have a bunch of excellent people from all over the industry that are working at the company.
Yeah, I recognize a couple names over there.
Yeah, and it's just. It's really kind of fascinating, and not every day is magical. Obviously, it's hey, you could wake up on a Thursday morning and your bank just went away, for example. It's
did that happen
but
to
all you? My money was there.
Was that one?
Oh yeah, that happened to us.
Oh my God.
Oh no, it was a fun.
Tell me about
days.
that. What was that like?
Well, I get up in the morning, so I'm on an Andreessen Horowitz mailing list. They're an investor in the company, a CEO mailing list, and there's all this grumbling going on about SVB, and I start looking at them like, what is going on here? And I started seeing what people were writing. I was like, is there a bank run starting right now on SVB? Are you kidding me? And I had to fly out to Utah that day. So I'm communicating with my team, and I'm like, hey, keep your eye on this. And I'm talking to some of my investors, and I'm like, hey, you see what's up? And they're like, oh yeah, it's overblown. Don't worry about it, so on and so forth. And then, I get on the plane, I'm flying to Utah, and as I'm going along, I'm like, I'm just watching stuff unfolding in real time. So I contacted my team, and I'm like, hey, we might want to get ready to move maybe half our money someplace else.
Yeah.
And, my VP of Finance, she's like, hey, we don't actually have another commercial banking relationship, so we're going to need one of those if we want to move money out. It's like, oh my God. So then we start shaking the bushes, like, who can we get to have a commercial banking relationship with, immediately? So Mercury is a customer of ours, and the guys who handle my personal stuff, they're a giant global bank as well. So I contacted my guys, and we contacted Mercury, and I'm literally on the plane, because I got to do the whole know your customer thing. So Mercury was already a customer of ours, so we already had a relationship, but I still, taking pictures of my driver's license on the airplane on this United flight that's got Wi-Fi that's dropping out 10 minutes out of every 15, willing each packet to get out of my laptop down to the ground. And then I land, and as soon as I land, I've got all these messages. People are call me. So I'm talking to my lawyers. I'm like, hey, I can just move all of our, all the money in the company to my own personal wealth management account. He's like, oh my God, no, don't do that. It's like, okay. And then, we get this thing going with Mercury, but by the time it was ready, the bank was already closed for the day, and then the next day it opens up, and FICA or FDIC comes in and shuts the doors. And literally all of our money was there. And I was like, oh, well, this is not great.
Wow.
We got to make payroll next week. So then we were into plan A, B, and C, getting a payroll plan together from, whatever sources we could, including, plan C was me paying personally to make payroll.
Yeah. You do what you got to do.
Yeah, you do what you got to do. And luckily, Sourcefire gave me the wherewithal to be able to do that. But man, it was a total mess. And then, my sister was visiting that weekend, and I'm just on my phone the whole weekend. My wife is entertaining her, and we're sitting at, we're at the dinner table on Sunday night, and the news came out that FDIC was going to, insure everybody and get your money back and stuff like that. It was there was great rejoicing.
Yeah, I bet.
And then, but then almost immediately I was like, but wait a second, we still don't have the money, and it's still all at SVB was still shut. So everybody in the world tomorrow is going to try to get their money out, which means we're not going to get easy access to it. So I still got this payroll problem. So then, we spent the next 24 hours working to actually get our money out of it, which we eventually did. And then we moved a bunch back because actually we've got great terms with them on a bunch of stuff, so we wanted to keep the relationship going.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting.
I thought you were going to say that Andreessen Horowitz came in and just said, hey, just put your money in our account for today, right, or whatever.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's not that easy because you can't just put it in their account because it turned into this omnibus fund, right? So they would have to have an account for every company. Otherwise, they'd have to put it on an Excel spreadsheet.
I think they would have to do it in Excel. But, you do what you got to do, right? You're off by a handful of dollars here and there. You just kind of do it.
A bunch of companies, the management teams, the CEOs did move stuff into their personal wealth management accounts and things like that. It was ugly.
Yeah.
Because I was talking to our lawyers, you're gonna break all these covenants. It's going to be a giant, compliance problem. Yada, yada, yada. I was like, all right, fine. I didn't really want to do it because I was like, if this gets screwed up all of a sudden, I'm going to be on the hook and maybe one of our investors decides they want to sue and that's my problem. I'm not doing that.
I saw a couple people who went through that, CEO friends of mine, and one of them in particular, I'm not going to out who the guy was, but he doesn't drink. I probably haven't seen him drink in probably 10 plus years or whatever. And he's at a party, and he's on his third glass of wine, and he just looks frazzled. I'm like, hey, man, everything okay? He's like, yeah, the whole Silicon Valley Bank thing, he kind of explains it. And his story was like they said they weren't going to let him do payroll, and then they did payroll twice. And so he was out this massive chunk of money he wasn't expecting, and then they thought he was trying to withdraw his money, so then they were putting stops to it, and all back and forth. And so it was 7 days of him just struggling. And by the time he was finished telling me the story, he had 2 more glasses of wine. And he's like, I got to walk around. I got to get up.
I spent that Saturday when the whole thing was blown up. I was like, some of our money was in a money market fund that was split across BlackRock and Morgan Stanley. And we got out the prospectuses and figured out who had the money. And I got them on the phone. And I was like, where's my money and when can I get it? They're like, we have your money. It's very safe. However, we can't get it to you because of the way it's being, accounted for. It's like, well, okay, I guess. So
I feel so much better.
Yeah, right. I feel a little better, but I felt good. At least I was doing something. I felt pretty cool for actually figuring out who to get on the phone. And they actually answered on a Saturday.
Yeah.
Yeah, but apparently they were getting a lot of phone calls.
I bet. It was a busy weekend.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk briefly, if you were willing to do so, about your sailing as well.
Sure.
So tell us kind of how you got into that and what type of sailing, because there's different types, right?
Oh, yeah. So I got into sailing in 2010. I was 40.
Perfect age.
Yeah, right. Well, so one day I was working, at Sourcefire. I was traveling for work, and I was sitting in this airport, and all of a sudden I was like, where even am I right now? I had like this moment of like cognitive dissonance where I was like, I don't even actually know where I am right now. I looked out the window and like, Mount Rainier's out the window. I'm like, Seattle, that's right.
I have such similar stories.
Yeah. Well, I'm literally traveling,
airport,
I have almost 2 million actual button seat miles on United, right? I mean, I've flown everywhere. And it was just like, my entire life is conference room, hotel room, airport, rinse, repeat, like all the time.
Pause real quick. So my version of the exact same story, I'm sitting there and I'm talking to the lady because my thing's not, back when they had paper tickets, it's not working, so I go up to the counter and she's like, oh, where are you going today? I'm like, going to Austin, Texas. She's like, no, you're not. I'm like, I'm not? She's like, no. I'm like, why am I not doing that? She goes, because you're in Austin, Texas. I'm like, oh. Well, I have no idea where I'm going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so I was like, there's got to be more to life than this. And before I started Sourcefire, so I moved to Maryland in the mid-'90s, and if you spend enough time in central Maryland, you eventually end up in Annapolis. If you spend enough time in Annapolis, you end up on a sailboat. And my little engineering heart saw this big, complicated machine that people knew how to operate and like do all this cool stuff with. And it was, silent, moving through the water and all this other stuff. I was like, oh, this is awesome. I got to learn how to do this someday. And one of my thoughts in the back of my mind when I was starting Sourcefire was, if this goes well, maybe someday I'll have enough money to be able to take the time to go learn. And then fast forward to 10 years later, and all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, like my actual like day-to-day life, like what I have to do every day to like do my job actually is not very much fun anymore. And so I thought, hey, wait a second, I want to learn how to sail. So I signed myself up for sailing school at the Annapolis Sailing School. And Sourcefire at this point, we were a public company. I didn't have to be there every single day to make it go anymore. Like, big company, very successful. And I just didn't need to be there every minute of every day. So I was like, I'm going to sailing school, guys. And they were like, okay, cool, have fun. And I went there and I spent a week learning how to sail, and it was great, and I loved it. And then, I went back a few months later and spent another week like getting skilled up on how to manage the boats and navigate and things like that. And then bought a little 30-footer with, co-owned it with Sourcefire's first CEO that I hired, Wayne Jackson. And then, did that for a year. And then the next year I bought a race boat because I kind of figured out if you really want to skill up, the fast way to get there is go racing because, a weekend of racing, you'll encounter more scenarios and situations than you'll do an entire season of cruising. So I started racing, and then my competitive instincts got kicked in, and I got, like everything, got a little overboard.
Yeah, no pun intended.
No pun intended, right. And then I bought a family cruiser to go sailing with my family on, and did that for several years. And then, my tastes and the things that I'm interested in evolved, and now I have a race boat that is a dedicated offshore racing boat for shorthanded sailing. So you can sail with as few as one people on it. You typically, right now, I just got the boat in December. Typically we sail with 4 on it right now, but it's a class of race boat that's made for doing very long distance races with very few people on the boat, and it's tons of fun. I love being out, way offshore. There's wildlife and the stars, and I can tell you a ton of stories. It's like a life less ordinary kind of thing. And then I also have a family cruiser, so I have a bigger family cruiser now, and I also have a bigger family. And that thing can go anywhere. Caribbean, it's been in Europe, the Caribbean, up and down the U.S. East Coast and stuff like that.
Wow, so you've really sailed, not just down the territorial waters, all over the place.
Yeah, well, the cruiser, we were actually on it when the pandemic blew up. We were in the Caribbean, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we literally had to run for it. The zombie apocalypse was happening. All these islands were closing up shop. You couldn't go to a bunch of islands, and we ended up going to Grenada. I knew nothing about Grenada. I had no idea of anything about Grenada, but I knew they had a really good marina for cruisers there, and I knew it was out of the hurricane zone, so if I had to leave the boat, it would be safe. And we went down there, and we were one of the last boats to get in, and then we ended up having to leave the boat down there. We almost sailed it 1,400 miles back to Florida to get it, keep it under our control, because there was a thought that, hey, once we leave this boat, we're not going to see it again for nobody knows how long. But there was a problem with the battery bank on the boat, and there were only me and one other really qualified sailor on the boat. So if the batteries go out, then the autopilot doesn't work, and you might also lose GPS and radios. And it's like that's pretty dangerous. We don't really know the Caribbean waters that well. Like there's lots of reefs and islands and stuff like that. So we said, no, we're not going to do that. So we ended up having to leave the boat. We caught literally the last flight out of Grenada. They closed the airport like an hour after we left and announced their first cases on the island. The airport didn't reopen for 7 months.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crazy. Anyway, 2 years ago, a few months before I took the job.
A few hours later, that would have been a very different story.
Oh yeah, totally. 2 years ago, like this month, me and my guys went down and got the boat and sailed it 2,100 miles up to Annapolis. So this is before I was working for Netography. We got it back, and good God, it was like just so much fun. Huh. I never sailed 2,000 miles. It was 3 hops, but it was just sailed up the Bahamas and then up the Gulf Stream to Fort Lauderdale and then to Charleston and then around Hatteras up the bay and stuff like that. Just fabulous.
Wow, yeah. Cool. So my real knowledge of it is mostly the catamarans. Have you ever been on like racing catamarans? Have you ever tried it?
So I've done beach cats, like little Hobie waves at like resorts in the Caribbean and things like that. Mm-hmm. I have a buddy who's got a catamaran. It's not a racing catamaran, but I've never been on like a really super hardcore racer. Mm-hmm. Although they look really interesting. There's a bunch. I'm close enough to it that if I really wanted to get on one, I could, because of my racing background, but I just, it's time and opportunity.
Yeah, the thing I thought was most interesting from a technical perspective, and to me, this is probably the closest analogy sport-wise to Formula One, is the catamaran racing, like the Oracle, wing sail type catamarans. Yeah. Like that is a really bizarre but very interesting technology where it's a split hull or split sail, like it's partly rigid or maybe even fully rigid depending on the design. Yep. And one of the coolest things is it seems to work at pretty much any angle. So it doesn't really matter where the wind's going, you're still going. And tacking is totally different.
Well, the wind's always forward of the beam, right? So your apparent wind always goes forward because the boats are so fast, they essentially generate their own wind, which makes them go faster and faster. So yeah, the Grand Prix racing that they're doing now on the 50-footers are like, they'll be in 18 knots of wind, they'll be going 50 knots.
That's crazy.
It's incredible. I mean,
it almost defies laws of physics.
Yeah, it's like, I know how it works, but still when you see it, it's like, there's no way that can work.
Someone's put an engine underneath that thing.
Yeah, right. It's amazing. And then they whip those things around the race course. They actually do fleet racing with them where they got like 8 boats on the race course at a time. It's like when they're coming at each other, their closing speed is like 100 knots. If those things actually collide at any point, like people will die. Yeah. It's like potential for ugliness is very high.
Yeah. And I think there's the team aspect of it I like, there's the technical aspect, and there is a lot of technology on these boats beyond just, a sail. I mean, although that is mind-blowingly complicated from my perspective. But just understanding the depth and like where things are and whether ships are going to potentially cross your path and salinity and all these other things you have to know if you're going to be really good at it to make sure that you're getting the most optimal path through the water. And
it's people don't really understand how high-tech sailboats really are. Like it's a sailboat. How high-tech could it be? A lot of the boats that I've raced on, some of the boats I've raced on, the whole boat is carbon fiber. The sails are carbon fiber. Like the entire boat is carbon fiber, and they're just these, this parade of triumphs of material science that floats on the water, and you can take anywhere, and it'll things the size of a house, and it's going 30 knots down waves off the coast of Baja California. It's crazy. And just even the stuff that I sail now, just these lot of very high-tech systems, especially the satellite communications, the navigation systems, things like that. It's really fascinating. My little engineer's heart is always like,
And it keeps evolving too. It's not like it's not done.
Well, Starlink is coming now. So we had Inmarsat. So you've got these little R2D2s sitting on the back of the boat, and the bandwidth kind of sucks. I mean, it's 192K or something like that. Now Starlink's coming. It's like gigabit. Mm-hmm. And can be always on. Yeah.
You can do Zoom calls straight from the boat.
Right, do a Zoom call while I'm racing offshore, which I really don't want to do. But I mean, all that stuff is possible now, and it's just going to keep improving.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So any lessons? So having, have you been able to bring anything back from the racing world?
I think really a lot of the lessons that you get from the racing world are kind of almost exercises in leadership. Like when I built Snort, like I turned into this leader, but it was just because I was building cool technology, and like I'm not the most obnoxious person in the world to be around, so people like take me pretty seriously, and I've got a pretty good reputation as being like pretty level-headed and thoughtful about what I do. But the things on the boats are that there are command decisions that need to be made. We're going this way, we're going that way, or something just catastrophically broke and we've got to like take action right now, where you have to take command and be in charge. And I think those leadership lessons that I've learned where you can't hide, it's not like, well, I don't feel like dealing with this guy today because it's been a rough day and I don't want to deal with the fact that the mast just fell over. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not an option. So. Right. Kind of taking decisive action and understanding that these problems aren't going to go away if you ignore them and things like that. I think it's just been something that gets you to lead a little more directly. Other lessons, it's kind of, I've always been a person who kind of looks ahead. I think I'm better at looking ahead in my professional world than I am in my sailing world still, but I'm getting better as time marches on. A lot of it's kind of
a confidence thing too. I mean, you have to have a lot of confidence in your abilities to be on a 2,100 mile in the middle of the ocean.
Oh, sure.
I mean, there's a lot of risk there.
So yeah, I know, but it's not like
just my life.
It's not, but it's not unconstrained risk. Like the risks that you've got, and you've got a lot of backups. So like there's life rafts, and there's satcoms, and there's EPIRBs, disaster beacons, and there's portable, sat phones that you can carry with you, and the traffic that's around you. You can call for help if you need it. You can call the Coast Guard for help via the sat phone or whatever if you need it. So there's all sorts of resources out there. So an actual catastrophic failure of the boat where you lose it so quickly that you're completely out of control is very rare. Mm-hmm. So I'm not so worried about that. One of the things my youngest daughter took up sailing last year, and she's on the high school sailing team. And to your point, the confidence thing, one of the things that I like seeing in her is her confidence increasing as she gets better at it and she gets more experience and time out on the water, because she's out on a boat with one other person, and they're making it go, and they're racing, and they're competitive, and she's getting better from last year. She was a little tentative where she got started this last weekend. They won almost every race that they were in, and she's throwing her body around the boat and hauling on the lines and like really racing the boat. And I was like, yeah, go get it.
It's badass.
And you can't talk to her when she's out there. You can watch her, but you can't talk to her. So she's just doing her thing with her skipper. You
just need a bigger megaphone.
Right.
It's getting LRAD.
Right. So yeah, and it's helped me with my confidence too. But a lot of it is just doing. Sailboats are like. You read about it and then you go do it. And once you do it, you can kind of really comprehend it and build confidence in doing simple as well as complicated things, or managing these huge loads in the sails and things like that. Mm-hmm. We had a really interesting episode last summer where we were taking our family cruiser up to New England for the summer, the hot months, like the Chesapeake in the summer is kind of miserable. So we take the boat up to New England because we figured it'll be fun to have it up there. And we were 70 miles off the coast of Long Island, and the steering cable that controls the rudder broke. So my daughter's on the boat with me, and then we've got 3 other capable racing sailors and me on the boat. So the thing breaks, we're in like rough seas, 8-foot waves, it's really windy, we've got a lot of sail up, the boat immediately wipes out, and it's out of control, right? The spinnaker up the front of the boat gets wrapped around the rig and gets shredded, like it's a mess really quickly, right? Because sailing, like, there's 2 modes of sailing. Everything is super cool, disaster, that's it. So we're in disaster mode, right? So this boat is like, uncontrollable at this point, and we start doing the stuff that we've got to do. We get out our emergency tiller, so you can hook this big metal rod directly up into the top of the rudder, and you can drive it like, a tiller. But the emergency rudder broke The emergency tiller broke, like some weld broke, and it just like came apart. So
Great.
that sucked. And then we're there, well, now what do we do? So my boat captain was on the boat with us, so I raced with him, but he's been sailing. His dad was a pro sailor, and he's been a pro sailor for most of his life. And he rigs, crawls down into the space where all the steering cables and rigging is, and he basically takes a bunch of blocks, pulleys, and rigs up a solution to make the boat believe that it's got two wheels on it, that the second wheel is still hooked up to the steering, and then we got control of the boat, and away we went. Now, it was a mess, but we attacked this problem, came up with a solution, he came up with a solution, and we got back underway, we got the boat up where we were going, and life was good. And my daughter was on the boat, and she saw everything fall apart, and then everything come back together, and us fix it and get moving again. And I just those are experiences that are hard to get otherwise, to be kind of like, this is a serious situation, but we got a handle on it, and we're going to move forward.
A true emergency, but one that's totally manageable with the right staff.
Right. Yeah, totally. If it had just been me and her, maybe not as great, but you never know.
That's the time for the emergency beacon.
Right.
All right. Well, how do people find you and your company? How do they get in touch with you?
Netography.com is the company. Finding me, come to RSA. No, just kidding. My last name at netography.com. Roesch at netography.com is kind of the usual way that you can get in contact with me. LinkedIn, obviously, as well.
Okay.
So
great. Well, Marty, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, no problem. It was great. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.